Anyway, thank you all, first of all, for joining me up on stage today. As mentioned, we want to talk about how digital reputation has changed and the impact that has had, whether in terms of regulation that exists or in terms of perhaps proposed regulation, and of course how that has changed given the events that we have seen over the past couple of years. But let me start by asking, when we are talking about reputation building in the digital environment today, which is something I think that all three of you are quite familiar with, how would you characterize the threats that organizations face, and how has this changed over the past couple of years? Minu, can I start with you, please?
Sure. So I don't know if it's a threat, but it's certainly a change.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the digital world around us, what does that really mean? One is speed of connectivity, different tools. But to my mind, it's always that when you're talking about a reputation, it's not digital or any, it's just reputation. And reputation, the biggest thing that for us as comms professionals is really the messaging, and that doesn't change. What probably changes is the outreach with it, because consumption of news is no longer the same. Audiences, our users are not consuming content the way they used to earlier. There is a significant drop in attention spans, so even the content that you create needs to be that much more immersive and relevant and something that appeals to them. So it's the amplification, it's the channels that you use. There's no one channel anymore. You could rely on, let's say, 4 or 5 outlets and it would work. Today, news is consumed in many, many different formats. So you have to be able to create either a definitive platform or be able to reach multiple platforms. So I would sort of say that's how you would navigate.
So it's less about perhaps the threat environment, but more about the kind of the medium that you're using to message. Punitha, if I could come to you next, and then I'll come to you, Rob, after that. What changes have you seen in terms of the kinds of issues you're facing online?
Thanks, Arun, and great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Maybe before I answer the question, I wanted to say that digital is an important part of reputation building, but there are many other elements to reputation building, and it's important to take a holistic approach. And some of it goes beyond the control of the comms professional, because you might be fabulous on digital, but if the organization is providing poor customer service or leaking oil into the ocean, your digital comms is not going to save you. So it's really important to have a holistic approach. In terms of what's changed, a lot has changed for pharma over the past few years, because pharma companies, or the names of pharma companies, have come into homes. Even my mum and grandma now talk about Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca when they never would have previously, and it's probably the case for many other grandmas as well. So I think that has brought benefits, but there's also been downsides to it. The most obvious one being around misinformation, healthcare misinformation, which was particularly a problem in the early stages of the pandemic when nobody really knew much about the virus, and so there was a lot of misinformation going around, and people had no credible sources and couldn't distinguish between what was credible and what wasn't. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of providing credible sources of healthcare information to people, and the industry has a strong role to play in that.
Yeah, indeed. It's big changes for pharma, and we'll talk about the fake news challenge in a little bit, I'm sure. But Rob, from your perspective, how have you seen the changing nature of threats online when it comes to corporate reputation?
And I fully agree as well that it is a holistic approach, right? But if we tackle it from a digital point of view, I think it's also a growing risk, right? So we've all seen the stats about increasing adoption and growth of social media, digital platforms, new technologies, as we've been talking about today as well. And you just notice that the way we consume news and information is changing, as Minu has said as well. So TikTok is a great example, I think, which in the end is a fairly recent social platform. But it's like 1 in 3 young people are basically using this as the main source of information, to find out about news, find out about events as well. And it's not just about the young people, right? It's also the main or the fastest growing source of information for adults as well. And the reason why I want to bring this one specifically up is because very recently, actually, you've noticed as well that these TikTok videos are appearing at the top of your search results, right, in Google. Meaning that whenever a prospect, a client is looking for a brand, a product, a person, industry topic, this kind of content, as well as any other tertiary content itself, can easily outrank your own brand properties, right? And this is really a space that you wanna own and influence in the end, because we must all agree that most of the online experiences do start in these search engines in the end. So when you put the lens of a crisis on there, any kind of negative news, right, will have much more longevity after the crisis has ended, right? And this can influence, could influence your sales. People have lost deals about this. It's going to scare off potential hires. So it's really about the challenge of how do you manage also that online presence with algorithmic changes that influence your brand visibility, basically.
Right, okay. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because the potential for crisis, as you mentioned, is kind of always there, and now we see it on various platforms. Minu, have you had to change how you approach crises because of the manner and the nature of them online, and the manner in which they play out?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like I said, speed is a big factor. The speed in terms of the spread of information, and though, to be honest, even before the internet came in, I don't know how many of you remember the Ganesha drinking milk in India. Mm-hmm. That was a viral thing that went overnight. The world was trying to feed, these stone statues with milk because there was a rumor. So things go viral all the time. There was no internet then, but it did happen. But that, you can imagine how much faster it has become with the connected world. And there, within that connected world also lies the challenge of what you say in one place can also have implications in others. So when you're thinking of your response, it's not just speed, but it's also relevance and context globally. At least for a company like us, we can't make a statement in one place without having some ramifications at a global level. So that constant balance between factual global statements, but equally local and relevant is something that we find we have to grapple with at all times. Right.
And Punitha, you mentioned, it doesn't matter how good your digital comms is, if you're leaking oil into the sea, or it does seem to me that these skeletons in the closet actually are more likely to be exposed because of the nature of digital communication today. The news travels fast, and we see a lot of stuff emerge on social media, and you see issues that were previously local just exploding and becoming global. Is that something that you can manage effectively?
Well, we try. So it could be skeletons in your closet, but it could also be business decisions, and digital means that borders and boundaries don't matter so much. So you could be making a business announcement on divestments or restructuring, and what might be a very local announcement. When we work on our communications planning for the announcement, we also factor in what happens if those who are unhappy with the announcement go leverage digital tools to make their views heard, and it goes beyond the country. So we factor that in when we do our comms planning at Novartis. We do that in a few ways. So we work with our global teams who look after the corporate social media channels and the social media channels of our CEO and executives. We put social media monitoring in place. But sometimes that's not enough. We made, I have an example in that we made a local announcement earlier this year, and we put all the measures in place that I'd mentioned. We had a small group of stakeholders who were unhappy with that business decision, and they made a coordinated effort on social media to make their views heard. Targeting, as we expected, the CEO and the corporate social media channels, but it surprised us in that they went even further and also targeted some of our other countries in Europe, for example, where it typically may not have reached. So yes, it was, I think it was about 5 people, but they managed to get a lot of traction because of digital. So definitely a learning there for us.
One of the big threats, I suppose we've mentioned this already, is the potential for misinformation, disinformation, and everything that comes under that fake news umbrella. I don't know if that's specifically what you were facing there, Punitha, but presumably this is something you all face when you're doing any kind of messaging on digital. Rob, I'll start with you on this one first. How do you see corporates tackling fake news as a reputational challenge, given that so much of it happens on not necessarily just on the big platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google, but on the the so-called more closed platforms like WhatsApp?
Yeah, fake news is an interesting one, right? I think definitely as well, because it's such a broad team. So for example, deepfake tech, etc., is advancing at a rapid pace as well. With the click of a button almost in the future, you'll be able to make like these videos and imagery of whatever politicians, corporate leaders that are almost indistinguishable, I think, from real and fake. And I think definitely as well in healthcare, right? It's something that brands are increasingly needing to tackle, of course. Mm-hmm. An interesting example that I've actually seen or witnessed during COVID, where a lot of misinformation was happening, of course, right? People talking about, you need to drink hot water to cure COVID, which is very risky and has led, of course, to accidents as well. But the UN, so the United Nations, was trying to tackle some of this misinformation. And what they found out as well is initially they were trying to put out facts, right? Saying, this is what we know of COVID, this is what we know how it spreads. These are the research pieces of, that are ongoing as we speak, but it wasn't as impactful, right? So they slightly tweaked their comms approach. And they actually started taking this misinformation that is online and integrating the misinformation into their own communications and debunking it, right? Correcting it. So it's a very small change of how you communicate messaging, but it was a lot more effective, right? So it's a combination, I think, of the debunking. It's a combination of, putting out your counter narratives. It is, any existing content that you have that is credible, authoritative, right, with a lot of expertise, trying to amplify that as well. And I think also creating new narratives, right? The crisis is very active, of course. COVID, there was so much information coming in on a daily basis. So creating new content in almost real time with new insights. I think they did this pretty well. Of course, they do have the challenges, but that was well done.
It does sometimes seem like there's just such a torrent of fake news out there that whatever is kind of, whatever the opposition is in terms of the truth, it never seems enough. Minu, for you, this is kind of, there's 2 ways of looking at the fake news issue. It's both a reputational challenge for Google, right? I'm sure that people say all manner of things about Google as such a high-profile brand, but also it's something presumably you're actually trying to actively tackle in terms of the information that's shared on your platforms, whether it's on YouTube or whatever. Do you feel confident that it can be tackled effectively? Particularly given a lot of what we see out there is being paid for, is being funded.
I don't think I can say. We can certainly move towards, and there's a lot of work we are doing in that area. Let me start with some of that work. First and foremost, our hope is to be able to reduce using AI and, of course, thousands of resources, thousands of people around the globe who are looking at content. But we have to remember there are billions of videos and billions of information that is uploaded on a daily basis. So it's, the odds are stacked. Plus, so we try and remove as much as possible based on certain triggers. There are helplines, there are places where you can go and point that this is not correct, and we will evaluate. So there's plenty of work happening to remove. The other thing that we're doing is creating an ecosystem of people who can help verify facts. So we have a fact checker community that we work with around the globe, who are also watching out and sort of putting out, like he said, a little bit of the debunking stuff that, hey, this is not correct, this photograph is from XYZ and not related to this incident, and they will sort of give you the facts as well. So there's a whole ecosystem that we're creating. I think the third thing is to put forward more trusted sources. So especially in times of crisis, and whether it was COVID or any other natural disaster or this current conflict scenario, we will go back and look at what's showing up in our search tools and try and make sure we always put the trusted information. Those are trusted news outlets, et cetera, or a government website, et cetera, where directing people to go to those trusted sources much more than normally. And of course, the fourth being giving people the tools in their hands to be able to verify whether is this the right news or not news. So every news item will have a little thing on the side. You can go and validate. So there's a lot of work that's ongoing. But I mean, to be honest, everything that's happening is a reflection of our world around us, right? I mean, it's a deeply polarized world. It's divided. And sometimes it's very difficult. And in fact, we're working on a program similar to that. What may be misinformation to me may actually be a valid thing for somebody else. Who's to decide that? Forget the scientific part of it or some of those myths. But there are certain deeply held beliefs, that are difficult to sort of break through. So to your first point of, do you think it can be, I'm not sure. But we're doing everything we can. I think there's also been, it's also arming our children and the future generation with the ability to think critical, have critical skills, critical thinking skills, so that you can just sort of try and lessen the impact. But yeah, tough to say whether it can go away.
It's a long-term challenge. Puneetha, I don't know if you wanted to comment on fake news specifically, but presumably it's been, it's, as we've seen in the COVID era, the pharma companies have been caught in the crosshairs in many different ways, maybe not Novartis specifically. But do you feel confident that it can be tackled effectively?
I think it's really tough. I think part of it might be around regulation, which I think you're going to come to. But I wanted to say on this point, I think Meena and Rob have talked about fake news and misinformation, but I wanted to say that in some cases, the misinformation isn't malicious and it isn't intended, because COVID, cancer, cardiovascular disease, these are really complicated topics, and it's hard to understand them, even if you work in the industry or if you're an informed journalist. It's still tough. And so what we've done in the past is we've worked with the Thomson Reuters Foundation to actually connect them with journalists and key opinion leaders, physicians in this space, so that they could understand the diseases in simpler terms, because then the content that the journalists then generate can be simpler and clearer for people to understand. So yeah, just an additional point that I wanted to build on.
Sure, yeah. Let me stay with you because let's talk about, perhaps the corollary to all of this, which is, perhaps more regulated speech online. Certain industries, of course, are more regulated than others, and some face the prospect, perhaps, of regulation. Vinitha, talk us through all the things you have to do from a pharmaceutical perspective when it comes to navigating regulation in terms of digital comms, and I mean, how difficult is that proving, and how hard is it to, I guess, navigate those challenges?
Thanks, Arun. So what everyone might not appreciate is that in the pharma industry, we're heavily regulated in terms of our external communication. So it might seem odd, but we're not allowed to talk to the general public, to patients about the products that we sell. That's something that's an absolute no-no. And that applies to our corporate channels, that applies to our digital campaigns, and it also applies to every employee. So if I were to work on a product and I'm thrilled that it's been approved, I can't go onto Facebook and say, oh, I'm so excited that this medicine has been brought to the market to help people who have this disease. So there's quite a few things we need to do. One is in terms of any of our content, it goes through very strict approvals, legal, compliance, medical, regulatory, to ensure its credibility and its accuracy. We also train our employees on what they can share in terms of our products and what they can't share, even on their personal social media accounts. And then folks like me who run digital campaigns, we have additional training, and mine is almost overdue. It's due next week. I got a reminder this morning, so I will be doing it this Friday. So we spend a lot of time on that to make sure that people understand what their responsibilities are. And then there's an additional step in that once we get through all of this and actually put the content out there, that's not the end of it. We can't just wash our hands of it, because we have a process called pharmacovigilance, which means that any discussion around any unintended consequences of a medication, whether a pro or a con, it has to go through a particular process to be looked into. So after we post content, after we share content, at least once a day, every single day, we need to have patient safety monitoring in place to make sure that if somebody puts a comment on there, that needs to be looked into, that it follows this process right away.
Gosh, it's a lot of work and a lot of
fun and games. Yes,
yeah, a lot of complexity. Minu, I mean, I don't think Google is regulated in that way. Definitely not yet anyway. How do you feel about the idea that more regulation is required if perhaps we want to minimize, tackle some of the challenges we face from disinformation, let's say, rather than misinformation?
I think as we've talked about this before in the past, Arun, where I've said that the world as it operates today is an increasingly digital world. But the laws and regulations that exist are for a different world and different era. And so it's very natural that one needs to they need to be updated and kept pace, right? And every new era brings with it a new set of complications. And therefore, you do need to think of new ways, of new laws that need to come in. So we're very cognizant of the fact that these are big issues, challenges that need to be dealt with. But it's also an opportunity for us to, because it's a new world, not every regulator understands this world, right? So how do we make sure we educate them so that there are no unintended consequences, right? I mean, our mission is to organize the world's information and make it available to everyone, everywhere. And we certainly don't want to see that getting impacted. Right? Of course, so it's not just about misinformation, it's about regulation in any format. So just our job is to make sure that we have the right perspective out there, sharing the right possibilities of what could happen where, but more importantly, actually even working proactively to say, okay, yes, this is a challenge. How can we use technology to help reduce or mitigate that challenge and find ways to work with the regulators to actually come up with solutions? So.
The other thing here is that digital is global, really.
Yeah.
The platforms are global, but laws are local, aside from the EU, obviously. But I mean, how much of a challenge does that pose? Because presumably, if you do face the prospect of regulation in one country, it may raise the prospect of other regulators following suit.
There are two ways to look at it. One is the contagion effect of regulation in one country, like EU will make a ruling and then suddenly every other country around the world wants to have the same ruling. Or today, actually, most of the APAC countries are leading the contagion effect, whether it's Korea or it's Australia with News Showcase, etc. That's one side of it. The other side of it is also this fragmentation of the internet that is ending up happening, right? I mean, there is a global internet, but then there became a Chinese web net, and then pretty much a lot of the countries are also sort of threatening because of cybersecurity reasons and various other local vested interests, etc. They all want to have an internet of their own, and then what does that mean? It means it just breaks, right? There is no then internet. So all the benefits again of the internet just disappear if it gets so fragmented. So that's one thing that we have to watch out for, and a constant thing that we keep the regulators, make them aware of. Coming back to the contagion thing, I mean, we deal with this on a daily basis. And it's interesting because sometimes there are messages that may work in one country and land well with the regulators or with the users. But there are messages that those same messages may not land well in another country. So there's a constant work that we do in terms of message testing as to what will play where. And then find the best way to sort of, maybe play one message more in one country and another message more in the other. But obviously, there are 3 or 4 key fundamental messages that are related to any issue. So keep consistent, but try and adapt them to the market, to the arguments that are being put forth, and work towards that. But yes, it's very real. Again, it goes back to what was said earlier, that you have to have a very globally coordinated effort.
Yeah.
But yet local. So it's an interesting.
Yeah, it's a perennial challenge, and we definitely do see more fake news laws coming in. If you look at different countries, and often that is linked to more political control. But Rob, do you think we're kind of reaching a point now when stakeholders, there's an expectation of greater regulation of corporate communication on digital platforms?
I think to a certain extent that's already happening, right? And kind of makes sense, right? Because all of these digital platforms, it's very easy for your message to reach mass amplification, right? So the impact and the size of this impact, it can be very drastic. And I think on the other end, from more of consumer point of view as well, what you notice in many research studies, same as some of these consumer expectation index reports that we've been running for the past few years, is that elements such as cybersecurity, trust, safety, are some of the top concerns, right, when dealing with any kind of online platform, open or closed, pretty much. So I think from that angle, the expectation is definitely growing. Actually, a point I want to make on the previous one linked to regulation as well is this regulation, you need to adhere to it, right? I think step one is indeed understanding how does legislation and regulation differ between countries, whether you're APAC business or global business, not just from a comms point of view, right? Also from like a data privacy point of view, GDPR and all these kind of things. But regulation should not always be a barrier to innovation, right? I think there's always definitely in pharma, in these high-risk industries or highly regulated industries, there are creative ways to get your message still out, right? So brands, so for example, we've been working with these pharma companies on asthma drugs, etc. And what you then do is you don't necessarily talk about the product or the drug, right? But you're going to talk about the condition, right, or a disease specifically. And instead of communicating through your brand channels, which are very restricted and regulated, you try to engage third parties, right? So we, for example, activate maybe lifestyle, fashion influencers, other industry experts to get the message out. People that actually have asthma can talk about it in an authoritative way, and talk about how to deal with it and how to still live good life, asthma associations, these kind of things. So I think sometimes you need to just be a little bit more creative in the way you anyway approach your broader corporate comms as well. It's not unimportant to forget.
Sure. And to that point, Puneet, then, and particularly in light of all the regulations you faced, do you still see that opportunity there in terms of reputation building for pharma companies on digital platforms?
Absolutely, and I'm optimistic about it because digital brings scale, it brings speed, where it enables us to target audiences, and it to a certain extent it's cost effective. And even though, for example, we can't talk about our product, what we can do is talk about the disease and help people understand the disease. So I mentioned cardiovascular disease earlier. It's the world's biggest killer, but 80% of those cases are preventable. So if we can partner with government and other stakeholders to help people understand disease better and prevent disease, then I think that's a win. The other thing we can do from a reputation building perspective is we can share other stories about our contributions to society beyond the pill, beyond the medication, in ways that build reputation for sure. And last but not least, digital helps us to really listen to what matters to the end user, to patients. So it means that we can have a better understanding of what really ails them beyond the ailment, and that makes us, puts us in a position to communicate with them to put out communications that is more relevant, but also to develop solutions that help them in better ways. So yes, I do.
Yeah, so maybe these constraints make you think more creatively, perhaps. We've got about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to see if there are any questions from the floor at all in terms of digital reputation and regulation, all the things we've discussed so far. Come and see if looks.
It's 5 more minutes from the lunch.
I know.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
People are hungry.
Okay. So anyway, I will ask one more question actually, because it's something we used to hear once digital technologies started becoming really popular around, social media, around 15 years ago. Was this idea that it could also help in terms of public affairs and in terms of engaging with regulators as well. Is that something you've actually seen happen, Meenu? Does digital give you another tool when it comes to trying to influence regulators?
I mean, look, at the end of the day, regulators are also customers at some point of time. Right? They're also users of our products. Their families are users of the products. So definitely there are just the regular day-to-day stuff that we would do, and digital does have an impact on KOFs. But specifically, if you're saying target audience in terms of public affairs, so leave the target audience outside of it, right? When you're trying to build a position or you're trying to put some perspective to a public issue, you still use most means of outreach, and digital is very much a part of that.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, absolutely, you can use digital. In fact, there are several other things. I mean, like he talked about when COVID happened, what became, at least for most of us, was the WHO site, which sort of showed the trends, where it's going, what it's going, so definitely. And the third parties that you heard, absolutely, I think digital plays as much a role as any other medium from even public affairs.
And Punitha, bearing in mind everything we've mentioned now, what would you say are the skills that you're looking for in your own team when you're looking to bring in talent?
So with limited resources and headcount, I'd be looking for somebody with a breadth of experience, but more importantly, learning agility, because I think communications as a discipline is evolving as well, and I think having that learning agility puts talent in a position where you can grasp new capabilities, and as the world evolves, comms needs to be as multifaceted as the world around it. So that would be my view.
Okay. And Rob, I mean, when I think with the onset of social media, we saw a lot of focus on social media content in terms of hiring within the industry. More recently, I think that has broadened into data analytics and maybe more visual storytelling. Are you seeing that changing again in the kind of skills that are required?
I think these skills are also being heightened, right? So I think data analytics, we talked about it beforehand as well, massive opportunities in digital, right? Combining customer data, offline data and other online research techniques. But I think for me, when I typically talk about skills of the future, I mention similarly, right? Adaptability, right? It's across disciplines, because we are in a world that's just increasingly moving faster, new technologies, new platforms, new ways of communication. So it's the ability to adapt to this as well, and maybe combined with critical thinking, right? Because we talked about fake news, misinformation. It's becoming, regardless of what all the companies, government, search engines are trying to do, there will be fake news. So how can you identify this as a user as well? So yeah, critical thinking, adaptability, and maybe as a final one, definitely being an APAC, right? I would say bravery, maybe, because I've worked in bravery, because I worked in Europe and US and Middle East, etc. But I mean, even for global companies, APAC is of course a bit of a different beast, right? And sometimes global case studies are just less relevant for the market. So the ability and the willingness to experiment, right? Trial and error, basically. This mindset of test and learn and continuous optimization, I think, is just crucial to have as well.
Some very good advice to end on there, and a very thought-provoking conversation. Can you join me in thanking our panel today? Thank you. Okay.